In this video, we're going to go through the process of building our first ASP.NET MVC application. Uh, the purpose of this lecture is really to show you the basic mechanics of what pieces you need within your project to make the ASP.NET MVC application work. Specifically, we're going to be looking at creating a controller, and we'll create a static view template. We won't really be utilizing a whole lot of code for this sample, but it's just to give you a sense and a feel for what pieces do I need and how do those pieces work together. To start, we're going to start out with a empty ASP.NET MVC project. If you do not have one or need directions on how to set that up, look at the previous video of creating an empty project, and we'll be utilizing that for this lecture. So to start, what we need is a controller that will accept our web requests and be able to handle or route our requests to the appropriate location. Now, a controller is really nothing more than a class. And to add a controller to your project, you'll go to your controllers folder, you'll right-click, you'll choose Add, and then at the top you'll see an option for controller. We'll click controller. We'll be brought up to a scaffold dialog, and we get a whole bunch of different scaffold options for our controller. In this case, we're just going to go with an empty MVC controller and click Add. It'll come back and it'll ask us for the name of our controller. I'm going to go ahead and call this my week 2 controller, and I'll click Add. Now we have a week 2 controller. You'll see in the code area that it's really just a class. It's a public class called week 2 controller, and it inherits a class called controller. This controller class comes from the system.web.mvc library, and it lives inside of the system.web.mvc namespace. So everything that we're building here as it pertains to controllers are just functionality that's inherited from a base class that actually is provided to us by Microsoft by the .NET framework. So inside of here we have a pre-templated action. We call these functions actions because they actually return action results. In any public function that is within your controller carries the term action. So function, and then in the context of a controller, they're called actions. And you'll see how that works and relates in a little bit. So this action index will serve up our view. And you'll see here that it says return view. And view is a function that's inherited from this controller base class. We won't get into the details of how that works right now, but we'll talk about that in future lectures. So this controller's responsibility is to take any requests for the index action, and when it processes that request, it will return the view that is associated to this action. Now, how do we get that view? The easiest way to do that is we can right-click within this function or action and choose Add View. When we click Add View, it'll prompt us with another dialog and ask us how do we want to set it up and how do we want to make things work and what templates do we want to use. These are all great things, and it helps speed up the process of development, but I want to walk you through what this wizard is doing for us. What the wizard will do for us is it will actually create a CS HTML document, and that document is the HTML template that ASP.NET MVC uses to serve up our web page. Now you'll notice looking here in your Solution Explorer that we have under controllers, we have a week 2 controller.cs file. That's our controller on our left. But you'll also see that under views, Visual Studio went ahead and made a week 2 folder. All of the views that are paired with the actions of the week 2 controller go underneath that week 2 folder. And the ASP.NET engine has what's called a view rendering engine or a view engine, and what that does is it does the relationship between the controller and the view, and it figures out how to make those work. ASP.NET runs off of a lot of convention or concepts. So if you're familiar with things like Ruby on Rails, it's very conventions based. You follow kind of these loose rules, and the engine or the runtime takes care of the rest as long as you follow those rules. ASP.NET provides you the ability to customize and change those rules, but by default there is a set of conventions that you follow, and as long as you follow those conventions, ASP.NET takes care of the rest. So if we follow the convention, under this week 2 folder, we would actually add a view to this folder, and that view would be our index view. So right-clicking on the week 2 folder, we'll choose Add, View, and you'll see that we end up really with the same exact dialog box. So the name of our view should match the name of our action or function. So the name of our view will be index. Microsoft provides us within Visual Studio a series of different templates. We'll explore those templates in later weeks, but for now we're just going to do an empty template without model because we don't have a model to associate to this view yet. We can create partial views, which we will not in this case, and we can also include a layout, which we have no layout to include at this point, so we'll just leave that unchecked. And we'll click Add. So ASP.NET will go ahead and create for us what really looks like an HTML document. You'll notice there's some squiggly lines and @ signs here near the top and a little bit of what looks like some C#. That is in fact C#. This notation of the @ sign and squiggly curly brackets, that is referred to as razor notation, R-A-Z-O-R. And the razor notation is used within your views to mesh or incorporate C# code into your HTML. And we'll be exploring that more next week, but that's just kind of a high-level idea of how we end up utilizing C# to build these templates. So our template is pretty straightforward. It's just some HTML tags, a head tag, and a body tag, and a div. Again, they should all be things that you should be very comfortable with. We're just looking at an HTML document at this point. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a tag in here with just an H1, and I'm going to do the classic hello world. So the process is that when we visit our week 2 controller and we call our index action, the index action will return its associated view, the index view. That view is simply this HTML document. This document will get picked up by the ASP.NET Engine. If there's any processing that would need to be done, processing means that it would take our C# code and actually run that code and then get some output. In our case, we don't have any of that, and then it'll take the HTML output and it will send it back to the client, which will be shown in their browser. So if we go ahead and save everything, and then I'm going to go ahead and click on my play button for Google Chrome. This will launch what's called IIS Express, which is just a local browser. And in that local browser instance, we will be able to see our HTML document. You'll notice the URL points to localhost :1127/week2/index. Localhost is my machine. The :1127 is the port that IIS Express is running on. IIS Express is just a lightweight web server that comes bundled with Visual Studio. And when we hit that play button to debug, that web server starts, picks a port, and then we'll launch our website utilizing that IIS Express web server. /week2. Week 2 refers to the name of our controller. If you look at our controller name is week 2 controller. So in Visual Studio, or rather when ASP.NET receives this URL, it'll look at this segment of the URL and identify which controller matches that name. So week 2 is the same name or the same front prefix to this week 2 controller. So looking at this prefix component of week 2, the ASP.NET Engine knows that this week 2 controller is the controller that should handle that request. If we look further, we'll see it also says week 2 controller /index. Index, in this case, is the name of the action that we're calling on our week 2 controller. So by simply using the routing, if you remember from last week's lecture, we talked about this idea of routing. Those routes go in and they parse this URL and they identify the controller and the action that should be used to process this request. So in this case, we're using our week 2 controller and we're calling the index action. If we put something else in here, like create, we'll get an error because we do not have an action defined in our controller called create. We can, however, create a secondary action. We stop our debug. We'll do public action result, create, and then here I'm going to return, and instead of returning a view, I'm just going to return content. And content allows me to type in raw HTML to be returned. So I'll just say create a page. So I'll save that. I will hit play again. That will rebuild my application, relaunch IIS Express, relaunch my website, and by default, IIS Express looks for, there's a default route that looks for a controller called home, or home controller, and an action called index. This will actually fail, this reload, because it's looking for that home controller, and that home controller does not exist. Our first or default controller that we created is called week 2. And I'll talk about that in later weeks, why I did that explicitly. So if we go /week 2 /index, we'll get our index page back. And if we go week 2 /create, we'll get back that raw content of create a page. So I hope that this gives you kind of a sense of how the data and how these components flow and fit together. Just one more thing to think about is when we start to incorporate models or classes into our controllers and our views, we can actually create an object within one of our actions, one of our functions, and then we can pass that object into our view and use it to populate our page. So for example, if we were creating a user profile page that showed first name, last name, email address of the person who's logged in, we could actually go to our database, pull out our user data, put it inside of a user object, and then pass that user object to our HTML view template, and then that template page would actually unpack and put in the first name, last name, email address of that user from that object. Now, if that sounds a little confusing, we'll cover that in more detail in a future lecture. So hopefully this has given you a good sense of how the controllers receive the request, they perform their action, they process that request utilizing an action, and then they return back a view, or in some cases just raw HTML content, back to the user's client, utilizing the controller and view components of the MVC framework.